dive today. One of the things PowerPivot lets you do is pretty much use the features of having an analysis services cube without going to the trouble to build a cube. So we'll do that so you can see it in action and have it make some more sense. It's also a tool that we consider to be a self-help analytical tool because you, again, don't really need a back-end programming or dev team behind the scenes to be able to take advantage of the powerful analytic capabilities that PowerPivot has. And it lets you connect to a workbook that has millions of rows, whereas with normal Excel you can't go up to, I think it might be at 1 million rows these days, but may not even be that high. So with PowerPivot it removes that limitation. And it's also going to leverage SharePoint for collaboration. So the first thing we're going to do is just go ahead and dive into the demo. I'm going to bring up my VM we have out here in the cloud. And just jump into the PowerPivot Gallery so you can first get an idea of what the finished product looks like. This is one of the views that SharePoint offers for your PowerPivot reports. They're basically Excel files with PowerPivot running as an add-in. You can't get this particular view in SharePoint without installing the PowerPivot add-in for SharePoint. So you can see it shows you how many workbooks you have in how many sheets you have in a single workbook. As I mouse over them, you can see the image is updating to reflect that workbook. You can scroll down and see a few more examples. Here's another one that has 2 worksheets, so you can just mouse over the graph and get a quick sort of view to be able to easily find what you're looking for. There's a few other views in the PowerPivot Gallery to explore. If we jump over to the Library tab on the ribbon. Right now this is the gallery. If we take a look at the Carousel, this is probably the most popular view for PowerPivot. Again, you get the idea where you can see very quickly which worksheets you're looking for. You may not even need to open the worksheet because with this view of it you can actually read the numbers and see the graphs on most worksheets without having to dive into Excel. You can rotate through your carousel until you find the actual worksheet that you're looking for. And when you finally find one you want to open it, you just click on it to bring it up in a larger window. Let me see if I can find one that looks interesting here. Some of these you may notice just look like Excel, and others are actually built off of reporting services. So there is a capability for PowerPivot to allow you to use reporting services as well without installing the full-blown version of reporting services. We'll go ahead and open this one that has the radar graph. This is just an Excel worksheet. So it's going to render it in the browser. You don't have to actually have the Excel client to view this report. And there are some slicers, which we talked about last time. If you haven't seen those yet, it's just the ability to click on any of these blue buttons, if you will, and it will limit the data so that it reposts to the chart. See, it just changed very quickly, and it's reposting the numbers in this pivot table as well. That allows you to sort of zoom in and filter your data. So for example, if we wanted to know more about these outliers on the radar graph that are in the Carolinas and Alabama, we could zoom in to the southeast region and get a clearer picture of what's going on with the states in those areas. And then we could then go ahead and open an Excel and begin to do more, add more to the graph or add more worksheets, whatever it is we wanted to do in a regular Excel. So let's take a moment and maybe build one of these together so you can see how we actually got it into the PowerPivot Gallery to start with. And to do that, I'm just going to start with Microsoft Excel. And again, PowerPivot is an add-on. It's a free add-on. So if you run a Google for Microsoft Excel 2010 PowerPivot add-in, you'll see it. You download it, follow the wizard, click Next, and it installs. And the result is you get this PowerPivot tab that appears on the ribbon in Excel. I'm going to then use the button to open the PowerPivot window. This is where the add-in really comes into play. And I'm able to now connect to data. And I have several different options for what sort of data I want to connect to. I can connect to the PowerPivot data that's stored in another report that I already created. I could go out here to what they call the Azure Data Market, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, but just so you can see very quickly, there are a lot of free data feeds out here that you can use. So if you want to practice PowerPivot on your own and you don't have data to play with, just follow the links to the Azure Market. click on the price category of free, and you'll see stocks data. Some of this I don't really even know what it is. Census data, legal articles. So that's probably not a great one to play with. You don't want articles. You would want something like the stocks data would come with several columns. So you pick out your data and connect to it that way. I'm going to go ahead and rather connect to a database because I think some of you may have your own data that you'd like to do some reporting with. So I'll cancel out of that wizard and click the From Database and go to SQL Server. Notice I could also go to Microsoft Access or an Analysis Services Cube. We'll go straight to SQL Server, and I'm just going to connect to my local host. And I have a database out here called BI2. And now I have the option of writing a query, or I can just select a table or a view. I've already created a view that has the data I'd like to bring. It's in here called, let's see, there it is, PowerPivot Export. And go ahead and click Finish, and it's going to start importing rows. And while it does that, I'll show you a quick view of what this thing looks like on the database side. Okay, so it's about 50 lines of SQL here. It's not too terrible. But basically, it's pulling information from an underlying table I have called membership, holds my membership statistics. It's joining it to find out what products my members have, what organizations my members belong to, and then these three tables that start with geo are all sort of building a hierarchy from what state they live in, what territory that rolls up to, what region that rolls up to. And then you can see with these case statements in the SQL, I'm doing a little bit of math to figure out how long the person's been there. So that's their tenure. And for the case of demonstration today, I'm also using their tenure to come up with a risk category. So my members are high risk, medium risk, or low risk. I'm also looking at a couple of fields in my membership, the subscription status particularly, to determine is this person new, are they active, is it a reinstatement, a cancellation, or a renewal. So I'm just sort of forming my data into a way that I'll be able to use it easily in Excel. And our wizard should be getting there. It's up to 3.4 million rows, which is actually pretty quick for that amount of data working in what's essentially an Excel application. It's going to max out momentarily at about 5 million rows. You might notice while we're waiting, you can also get your data from data feeds on the internet. You can give it the URL of a data feed, or from a text file if you've got comma separated and tab delimited examples. Or other data sources, you could set up OLADB if you're not coming from a SQL server, you're trying to connect to Oracle or something in a different format. And it's almost done. I think it's 5.5 where it's going to stop. Okay, so we've got 5.5 million rows. That's a lot of data. We click Finish, and it opens it up in what's just an Excel data table. You can see here's all the columns that I pulled in from my view: the quarter, the year, month, the risk profile, the tenure, my case statements, what product they have, and my regional hierarchy. If we scroll over, you can see, so I go, for example, from North Carolina belongs to the Carolinas territory, which rolls up to the Southeast region. So that's my data set to work with. Now that I have all of this data, I can crunch it into a pivot table just by clicking the pivot table button. I can jump straight to a chart. I'm going to go ahead and work with the pivot table first rather than a chart, and drop it in this empty worksheet. And here are all the columns of data I have to work with, so we can just start building our pivot table. Let's try, for example, let's use that tenure column and see how many new joins we have. And some of these, it doesn't make the best guess as to whether it's what we call a slicer or a dimension, where you're actually categorizing data versus something you're counting. So you may want to double check, and if it didn't put it in the right place, You can drag and drop to change your pivot table. This is just regular Excel at this point, not much to do with PowerPivot, but you are able to drag and drop those columns to different areas on the chart. We'll look at active members, cancellations, renewals. So just get a quick snapshot of all those different measures that we had. And you don't get commas all the time by default. You can very quickly change that by going to your value field settings, number format, and tell it that this is a number and it doesn't have any decimal places, and I'd like to see a comma. So you can do that when you're building a report. I won't take the time to do that for everything now. And we could also maybe add a slicer. So let's try year. And there's an example of where it didn't guess right, because year is numerical. It thought that it was something it should add, but it's really a slicer. So I'm just going to drag it up here. And now I can quickly filter on my data. Just show me 2010, just show me 2009. I could clear my filter, use the control button, select multiple years. So you get the idea. Once you've finished building your chart or your pivot table, whatever it is you'd like to do, this is where SharePoint now comes into play. You could save it to your desktop and be done with it, but we're going to go ahead and publish it to SharePoint where other people can use it as well. Oops, I didn't want to go to Save As, got ahead of myself. Let's go to Save and Send, and we'll save to SharePoint. And it knows I already have saved in my PowerPivot Gallery before, so let's save a shortcut for me. It is going to take a moment the first time because it's going to have to transfer a lot of data into my SharePoint environment. I lost my copy and paste of my password, so bear with me for a second. It's out here in the cloud. Okay, and we should see that appear in a moment over in our gallery. Oh, I have to give it a name. Let's call it Demo Book 1. Must have done this practice thing, so we'll just overwrite the old report. And now it's going to upload those 5 million rows into SharePoint. And at this point, you should also know that not only have I installed the add-in for the client, Microsoft Excel, but there's a separate add-in that you install in the SharePoint server for SharePoint so that it can also handle the PowerPivot data. And essentially, when you install this add-in, what it's doing to crunch those numbers behind the scenes is it's running a cube, an analysis services cube, on your local client. It's a scaled-down version of it. You didn't have to build it in analysis services, which is a SQL product like you normally would. But it actually went, and every time I drag and drop and point and click, it's using a cube behind the scenes to crunch those numbers. So now that I have it over in my gallery, let's track it down there. I can allow other users to not only open it and view it and play with it, but I can actually allow them to create their own new charts and graphs using my data source. So this way we don't have to keep duplicating those 5 million rows of data everywhere. They can actually come in and click this little drop down and create a new Excel workbook or even a new report builder report. So again, the big idea is there is one data set stored in SharePoint with access to all of your SharePoint users, so you're not duplicating data, which is a beautiful thing. We're going to go ahead and take a look at what it might look like to build a report builder report, because we haven't seen anything to do with that yet. All we've got is data in Excel. And there's a little trick to remember when you click this button to create a new report builder report. I thought for the longest time that an error occurred and was trying to figure out what happened, because you see that window open and close and nothing happens. But what it actually does is it puts a new report in the gallery down here at the bottom, and it just gave it a new name. So it gives you that as a starting point, and then you need to open the report and go design it. So again, you open it, looks kind of like an error because it's blank, but the answer is it hasn't been built yet. So we use the Actions menu and go to Open with Report Builder. Report Builder is a client-side application. It will download and install the first time that you go to use it. It's very small. It's a very scaled-down version of reporting services, but it essentially allows you to build the fancy charts and gauges and widgets and all of those things that reporting services would allow you to build on the client side. So you can see here it opened. It's just an empty chart, but it has my data source from my PowerPivot SharePoint book there. And I'm just going to right-click on that and click Add a Data Set from this data source. It has a wizard to do my query builder. This looks just like reporting services at this point for anybody familiar with it. And here's all of my what we call measures and dimensions from the Excel workbook. So I still have that sum of cancellations, and I have my sum of renewals. I can slice this. Maybe this time we'll do something a little different. Let's look at it by region, maybe by state. And you could filter if you wanted to. I could put a year in here. It often makes sense to only look at your data for 1 year at a time. So let's look at the most current year. You can parameterize all of this if you put the time into it. We'll go with this for now and say OK. And now we see my data set showed up over here that I just built. So let's go ahead and add some kind of chart. And we could build any sort of chart or gauge, but what I'd like to show today is a map, because that's something that you wouldn't be able to do just inside of Excel itself, and you'd want to take advantage of this report builder tool. So we're going to use the map wizard and grab one of these US maps and follow our instructions here to click next. You could even add Bing to it if you wanted to, but we're not going to do that today. And next. Now we want an analytical map, which basically means I want to join it to my data sets and change the colors or do something according to the data in my map. If you just choose a basic map, it's just going to show you some images of the United States, kind of like a Visio file. And you can also maybe do a bubble map today, because bubble maps are neat. They also join to data. So we'll do that. We'll choose our data set that we just created. We need to tell it how the map states line up to our data set. This is a little confusing the first time you do it, but what it's basically asking me is what field in your data, and down here I have the data state, and that matches the state name that the Microsoft built-in maps are aware of. So I'm going to tell it the state name built-in field matches my field called state, and say next. And you can change your theme, all those things. We're going to use bubbles to visualize our data, and let's visualize the renewals so we can see how big the renewals were in different parts. And obviously you could add labels, change colors, do all of that, but we'll just go with this since our time is limited today. And let's see if we can make it bigger. When you're ready to preview your report, make sure it works. You click Run. It'll go ahead and pull in the data, so we can see we've actually got a lot of renewals over here in what is that? North Carolina, a lot of renewals in Pennsylvania, a whole lot in Washington State. Let's say you have a bubble chart. You can just see by the size of the bubble how big your data is, and it gives you the legend over here. And we'll just stop there and go ahead and save this. And you can see down here in the status bar it says that the current report is pulling from the BI demo site. And it takes a moment to save, but we should be able to jump back and refresh our report. And there it is. And now we can go back out to the PowerPivot Gallery. Maybe jump to that carousel view because it's cooler. And there's our new report. It's a little bit skewed in the carousel view, so maybe I work on resizing later. again, you can open it. You could make it interactive. I could have put hyperlinks on the bubbles to drill through to other reports or other SharePoint pages. Anything that you could do in reporting services is up for grabs. So that's, in a nutshell, what PowerPivot will do. I'd be glad to continue, but I think maybe we should take a break for questions, because I know there are a lot of questions popping up about this technology. So let's go ahead and see what we've got. We have one question. What is the website to download the free PowerPivot add-on? Well, that's probably going to be a very popular question. I don't even know offhand, but I bet I could find it pretty quickly. Let's try this. PowerPivot for Excel 2010. Download. It's the second hit I got off of my Google. So you just need to do a quick Google. It is out there. It'll be slightly different for SharePoint. You'll want to look for the one for Microsoft Office SharePoint Server. But this is it. It requires Microsoft Office 2010, or it'll go 32 or 64. But you really need to have the RAM. It says here 2 gigs recommended. I would not put it on a box that has 1 gig of RAM. It'll kill your machine. So make sure you do have enough RAM. We have another question. Do you have to be an admin to publish to SharePoint? You don't have to be a SharePoint admin, but you need to have contribute rights to the library that you're publishing to. You're really just publishing into a document library. So as long as you have edit rights to the document library, you'll be able to do that. And I have another question that says, by saving the file to the PowerPivot Gallery, is it taking all 5 million plus items and adding them to SharePoint in a list? And, well, it's not putting them in a SharePoint list. It is storing them in that analysis services cube format behind the scenes. So it's not like putting 5 million rows of data in a list. No, it absolutely wouldn't do that. And the algorithms for cubes, if you've ever worked with cubes, are highly patented and pretty amazing. They'll take 5 million rows, and your cube is a couple megabytes. It's very small. Another question. What is the difference between Performance Point and Report Builder? Well, Performance Point is really the tool that's housing that cube of data behind the scenes, and Report Builder is a tool that you put on top of it for presentation. So Report Builder allows you to add the report like I just built a moment ago, where you're displaying the data, but it's actually pulling its data from the PowerPivot Excel spreadsheet as a data source. So really you can think of PowerPivot as a small cubing software, and then you use Excel and reporting services on top of it as the presentation layer. Can it run on Microsoft Office 365? I am not 100% sure. I can take that as an action item and follow up. If you want to shoot me an email, you'll see my address come up here shortly. I would think so, because all it really requires is SharePoint 2010, but I don't know if that would be an enterprise license, so I'll get back to you on that one. Do you have SharePoint Enterprise Edition and Excel services to use the add-on? Do you have to have? Okay, so that's a little bit. I believe you do have to have the Enterprise Edition. Yes, most of the BI tools require the Enterprise Edition with SharePoint, but you don't have to have it for Excel. You can use it locally on your own desktop as long as you have Excel 2010 from the download I just showed you a moment ago. You just can't really collaborate and share that as a data source with other users in SharePoint unless you have the Enterprise. Okay, we're going to jump, change. Oh, hold on, I have one more question. Let's see if I can multitask here. So, is the mapping function available to the state, county, zip level? The answer is yes. However, it's going to get more complicated. The map that I chose was one of the out-of-the-box maps that just had state in it. You can actually choose to write your own It's basically your own latitude and longitude coordinates. You can do that in SQL, and then as long as you pull those coordinates in with your query where you imported, I used that view. If I had included latitude and longitude spatial coordinates in my query, then yes, you can map to the county level and you can map to the zip code level, or you can aggregate up and just slice the United States into 4 major regions if your sales districts, for example, are broken out that way. And there are a few free maps that you can find. The Census Bureau posts a few on counties, so you can use your latitudes and longitudes to plug into those as well. Another question, why would you use Performance Point? Well, I hope some of you already know why you might use it. It is a very powerful tool that allows you to crunch millions of rows of data without having to license and have the expertise to know how to use other software like Business Objects or Microsoft SQL Analysis Services to crunch those numbers. Obviously, you can't just open your regular Excel client and stick 5 million pieces of data in it and crunch the numbers, especially not as quickly as you just saw. My VM in the cloud does not have that much RAM. It's not a very powerful machine. So it's free and it's pretty easy to use, and it gives you a cube and a pivot table. So that's why I would use it. We have another question here. When you use PowerPivot presentation options, are just Excel or PowerPoint only? And can you use reporting services to display the data? So again, the model is that you can choose to install the add-in just for Excel and work locally, or you can choose to also install the add-in for SharePoint so that you can share that data with other users and put it into the PowerPivot Gallery in a website. Otherwise, you're just using Microsoft Excel with that extra tab on the ribbon, remember. So they're better together, you might say, for the technologies, but you don't have to use them both together. And if you are using SharePoint with it, then you get that new feature to build the reporting services report on top of it. So that's another example of how they're better together, because you get the integration with Report Builder. And yes, in that example, I used Report Builder to build a reporting services report on top of my PowerPivot data source. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Julia. Thank you.
So again, if you all have any more questions, Anne's email address is there as well as mine. If you're interested in learning more business intelligence and reporting, we are having a virtual class on Monday, December 12th from 10 to 3 Eastern Standard Time. You can register now at susqtech.com/virtualvi. Our next webinar, again, will be November 10th from 1:30 to 2 o'clock. It will be Introduction to Nintex Forms 2010. You'll be one of the first to see Nintex Forms 2010 in action. You can register at susqtech.com/webinars. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope you benefited from the presentation, and have a nice day. Thanks.